Well, welcome to the 30th episode of the podcast and webcast Ideas and Lives that I, Bob Lerman, have been doing with my colleague, Tzvi Bodie. Hello, Tzvi.
Hello, everybody. Today we have a guest who I am meeting for the first time.
And me as well, but he's a very distinguished individual, Nathan Lewin, who has a very interesting background and career, and among other things has tried or appeared in front of the US Supreme Court for something like 34, 35 times. We'll clarify that as we go. He's also a very interesting commentator on affairs in the world, including especially Jewish affairs. So welcome, Nat. We're going to call you Nat today because that's what your friends call you, and we'll try to be friendly. So welcome, Nat.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm glad to be here and respond to the extent that my background or what I've done is helpful you or useful to others. I'm glad to help out.
Okay, well, we tend to talk about the arc of people's careers and how they got started. So tell us where and how you grew up, and maybe we'll even getting into the high school experience, but high school and before.
Well, until the age of 3.5, I grew up in Lodz, Poland, large city, the second largest city, I think, in Poland, because my family came from a very distinguished rabbinic ancestry in Poland. My grandfather, who was a victim of the Holocaust, killed in a pogrom that the Ukrainians held in the city of Lvov in the beginning of July 1941. He was murdered together with his brother. He had escaped to that Polish city from the city where he had been the chief rabbi since 1926, a city Rzeszów, R-Z-E-S-C-O-W, which has been in the news recently because it is a location from which a lot of the reports are being transmitted regarding the war in the Ukraine. And you see that on the TV screen, Rzeszów. It's a name that most people are not familiar with, but that's where my grandfather was the rabbi. My father was a very distinguished young intellectual rabbi also, who would have followed in his father and grandfather's footsteps in Poland. And as a matter of fact, after he was married to my mother, who came from a very well-off family in Amsterdam, Holland, they moved to Lodz, and that's where I was born in 1936. And my mother, being an avid reader and really up to current events, much more than her neighbor in Lodz, knew what was going on in Germany, Kristallnacht and all that. And she made my father, who as a matter of fact had been elected to the city council of Lodz. He was representing the Jewish community in that city. Soon after he came, after his marriage, they elected him with a very substantial vote. The Jews of Lodz elected him to the city council. And he, as a matter of fact, wrote years later about debates that he had in the city council against anti-Semites. But my mother persuaded him that if Hitler were to come into Poland, we could not possibly stay. and Hitler marched in on September 30th, and we were on our way out together with my grandmother, her mother, her brother, and we got out of Poland, smuggled across the border into Lithuania. I was told many times that as a 3-year-old, I was carried through the forests and told that I'd better keep quiet because if I made any noise, the wolves would get me. And I was smart enough, even at the age of 3, to listen to that advice. And we got into Lithuania, we got to Vilna, and my mother, who was very enterprising, said, we can't stay in Vilna. Hitler's going to get here too. So she tried to get, and it's a long story, which I won't go into. She tried to get visas to go to the Dutch East Indies because she had been a Dutch citizen. But since my father and I were not Dutch citizens, the Dutch said they're giving no visas to the Dutch East Indies. But when she wrote to the Dutch ambassador in Riga, he wrote back saying, well, maybe you want to go to the Dutch West Indies, to Suriname or Curacao. You don't need a visa to go there. And my mother said, oh, that's great. Please write that into my travel document. And he did. And the local Dutch consul did that also. And that opened doors to more than 2,000 Jewish families who had sought refuge in Vilna and received visas, transit visas, from the Japanese consul, whose name is Sugihara. He is highly regarded, considered a righteous Gentile in Yad Vashem in Israel, and regularly are events honoring his memory because he sat down and in the course of a month wrote more than 2,000 visas by hand for people to go to travel by way of Japan to Suriname or Curacao. And we did that. What happened was we got really what were the first transit visas to Suriname and Curacao for which my mother had gotten by her ingenuity and persuasiveness and the fact that she was untiring in her efforts. She got it, and then other Jews in Vilna heard about it and also rushed to the Japanese consulate in Kaunas to get similar visas. And at the age of 4, we traveled from Vilna to Moscow, and from Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Railroad for 2 weeks to Vladivostok, and from Vladivostok to Kobe, Japan. And I got to Kobe, Japan in 1940. And my father, because he was a distinguished name, even as a young rabbi in Poland, was on a list that the Jewish organizations had submitted to the State Department, so that notwithstanding the restrictions that limited Jews' entry to the United States, Isaac Lewin and his wife and then 5-year-old son were admitted to the United States in 1941. And that's how I got to America. I didn't know any English when I got to the United States. I tried to learn it pretty quickly. My mother had stayed over in Kobe because she was hoping to get her mother and her brother permission to get to the United States. So I do have copies of letters that my father wrote to my mother. And I was 5 years old and learning English. And he says that I was doing very well. And as a matter of fact, I was telling people I was 5 years old, but I knew 6 languages because I had spoken Polish and German and Yiddish and Hebrew and Dutch. And so I then, and Japanese. So I
Did you
thought
keep up with, how many languages did you keep up with?
almost none. Once I learned English, I mean, Hebrew, I learned in school again, and Yiddish I learned from my grandmother when she finally, after the war, she was the only surviving grandparent I had. My other three grandparents were victims of the Holocaust. My mother's father was killed in Auschwitz, and my father's parents, his father was a very distinguished rabbi,
Yeah.
and his mother was gassed in Belzec when she was found and sent off to the concentration camp to death camp at Belzec.
So where in the US, so you came to the US and to New York, or where did you get to?
Well, we came from Japan, so we arrived by boat in March of 1941. My mother was still in Japan, but my father and I arrived in March of 1941 in San Francisco. And from there, we made our way across the United States, stopped for a while in St. Louis, where my father had made an acquaintance with a leading rabbi in St. Louis, and then got to New York. And we ended up, after my mother came, living on the west side of Manhattan.
And what was the reason that you chose, or your parents chose, Manhattan?
Well, the large part of the Jewish community was in New York, and my father had both acquaintances, and my mother had some relatives in New York. So there wasn't much question about the fact that we would come to New York. And my mother, because of her background and all that, really preferred to live in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is where we settled. And I went to school because they had a school bus. I went to school at the Ramaz School, which was then a young institution, just a couple of years old, but it was a Jewish day school that served Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, essentially. And they had a school bus. My parents were very protective. I was then an only child. It was not until I was 16 years old that my parents had another child, my brother, who's now currently living in Brooklyn. But I was an only child, and as I say, they were very protective. So I went to.
Did your father understand English?
My father learned. My parents were very good linguistically, and my father learned English. But he initially, when he came to the United States, immediately started writing about the Holocaust in Yiddish. He was fluent in German, Yiddish, Hebrew, French, but he wrote articles. The way he supported our family was as a Yiddish journalist in New York. And he wrote articles very early on about the Holocaust, which ultimately selected articles were published years later under Yiddish titles, Korban Rapa and Dochen Korban, and they had articles that he had written that were published in the Yiddish press that wrote about the great disaster going on in Europe at a time when in the United States, official Jewish policy in the New York Times was to cover up what was going on. He was one of the first who was really telling the truth of what was happening and what the Germans, the Nazis, were doing to the Jews in Europe.
And then what was his profession ultimately in the U.S.?
Ultimately, his profession was he was a professor at Yeshiva University. After a number of years, his expertise, he wrote books on Polish Jewish history, on responsa literature, rabbinic responsa. So he was offered to be a professor at the Revel Graduate School, Yeshiva University. And after he started that, he became friendly with Dr. Belton, who was the president of the Yeshiva University. Dr. Belton suggested to him that maybe he would also like to become the Hebrew principal of a new girls' high school that was started by Yeshiva University. Yeshiva University High School for Girls. It started in Brooklyn and had a Manhattan chapter. And now it's a very well-established institution, Yeshiva University High School. But my father was the first Hebrew principal both in Brooklyn and in Manhattan when those schools opened up, while at the same time teaching at the graduate school of Yeshiva University Jewish history and Jewish response on the history of Jews in Poland. And he kept writing and kept volunteering his time. And that was, frankly, when people say to me, you know, why have you done the things you've done during your life of offering volunteer assistance to Jewish causes? It's because I grew up seeing my father doing it. He wasn't getting paid anything, but he became a non-governmental representative to the United Nations. He fought kosher slaughter and the enactment of the Humane Slaughter Act in 1958. He wrote many things about that had to do with Jews. What do you do with Jewish orphans? Or how do you get them back to Jewish homes? All kinds of issues. And he spoke at the UN Economic and Social Council and drafted a convention against religious discrimination, which ultimately, believe it or not, the United Nations General Assembly adopted. And they gave my father an award for what he had done for the UN.
Now, when did your legal pursuit of the legal profession begin?
Well, again, to that extent, my father had gotten a law degree at the University of Lvov. As I said, he was multilingual. He was a rabbinic scholar, but at the same time, his father, who was the rabbi in Rzeszów, felt that he had a secular education. And my father, largely self-educated, but nonetheless enrolled at the University of Lvov and got a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Lvov. So all his life, people called him Rabbi Dr. Lewin, because he was both a rabbi and a JD, Juris Doctor. He never practiced law, but his interest in the law, I guess, kind of came down to me to some extent. And when people would say to me, as I was going through high school and college, what do you want to be when you grow up? In high school, I thought I was an expert mathematician. And the high school advisor told me that what I should do is I should study to become an actuary, because actuaries make $100,000 a year. He said, that's incredible. And you could do that if you become an actuary. I was the leading scorer for the Talmudical Academy, Yeshiva High School. I was the leading scorer in the city for 1 week in the interscholastic math competition. That was one of the highlights of my high school career. But I left math ultimately when I got to college, became more interested in English literature and government, and decided that I would apply after college, where I managed to get very good grades, be close to the top of my class, and have a political career and write an original musical comedy, which we put on for 2 nights at a theater in Midtown Manhattan. I did all those things, but I decided I was going to go to law school. My father was not overjoyed with that. He wanted me to be a rabbi, and he thought I could become a leading rabbi in the United States. But truthfully, that course of study, although I'm very interested in the rabbinic literature, I have, you see the background here, it's just a very small part of my library. I have a huge library that I'm very proud of. But I decided I would apply to law school. And I applied to law schools, to Yale and to Harvard. I took the LSAT, which I aced. I mean, I got very high grades on the LSAT. And on the basis of that record, I was admitted to Yale, to Harvard, and I think to Columbia. I applied as well. And I thought I was going to go to Yale Law School because it was close to New York and I could come home from New Haven for weekends, for Shabbosim. And I originally told my father I'm going to go to Yale Law School. And at my yeshiva college graduation, I was the valedictorian, and the father of a classmate of mine, who happened to be the only person I knew who was a lawyer, an actual practicing lawyer. And he said to me, Nathan, you've gotten this terrific record. What are you going to do now when you graduate? And I very proudly said to Mr. Miller, I'm going to go to law school. And he said, what law school are you going to? And I said, well, I'm going to Yale Law School. He said, oh, Yale, nice. It's too bad you weren't admitted to Harvard. I said, but I was admitted to Harvard. Not only that, Harvard gave me a full scholarship. In those days, the tuition at the Harvard Law School was, believe it or not, $1,000 a year. And whereas Yale had said half loan and half grant. I did not come from a wealthy family. And the truth is, if I had to pay that tuition, I don't know whether I could have gone to Harvard or to Yale. But Harvard gave me a full scholarship. And this lawyer, who was the only lawyer I knew, said to me, Nathan, if you were admitted to the Harvard Law School and you don't go to the law school, you are crazy. That rocked me. You are crazy. I went home, I said to my father, look, I'm told by Mr. Miller that if I don't go to the Harvard Law School, I'm crazy. Maybe I should go to the Harvard. And my father said, well, you won't be able to keep kosher up there, will you? I said, I'll find out. I think maybe I could. And my father said, well, I already sent in $100 deposit for Yale Law School. What's going to happen to that? That was not, funny money in those days. That was real investment. I said, well, I don't know. Let me find out. And then I checked and I found out that there was an apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 3 graduates of Yeshiva College who kept co-apartment, and they were looking for a 4th roommate. And there it was. I reported that, and I told my father, I guess I'm going to go to Harvard. And I went to Harvard. And the fact is, Harvard, my class standing, in those days they had class standings, in a class of 485, my class standing, based on written exam, you had a written exam at the end of the year in each of the required courses. And based on the written exams, I was number 6 at 495, just simply based on it. And that meant that you were invited to work and join the Harvard Law Review, which was a very distinct group of people. It included, among others, a man by the name of Antonin Scalia. Now, I played ahead of Antonin Scalia in the class, but that didn't mean that in life I was going to supersede or place ahead of Antonin Scalia, but he was a lifelong. And
You must have argued cases in which he was on the Supreme Court, and you were arguing the case in front of him.
definitely, I argued case before Justice Scalia. The first case that I argued in a court in which Justice Scalia was a judge was when he was still on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which is where he was appointed. And I was representing a congressman whom I had represented in a trial who was convicted of having failed to report substantial loans that he had gotten on his financial disclosure form. I argued, and I thought I had substantial help, documented help, that this could not be a felony. Congress, when it enacted the law, said the worst that you could be punished for if you didn't include this was as a misdemeanor. And I argued that in the Court of Appeals. And who was on the panel that heard that argument but my classmate, then Judge Scalia? I stood up to argue the case, and I must say in the audience was a friend of that congressman whose name was Orrin Hatch. He was a friend of the Congress. And I started arguing the case, and Scalia said to me as I'm arguing, who cares what the legislative history says? The important thing is, what does the law itself say on its face? And the law on its face didn't say that. The legislative history was clear. But Scalia became known for the fact that he thought legislative history was irrelevant. But this was early on when he was on the Court of Appeal. And he badgered me the whole argument, and ultimately wrote the opinion against me in the Court of Appeals, sending my client to jail. But I recall that as we walked out of the courtroom that day, Orrin Hatch said to me, that guy up there, Scalia, he thinks he's going to be on the Supreme Court someday. He'll never make it to the Supreme Court. This was not among Orrin Hatch's more better predictions.
Yeah.
But I recall him saying that to me.
So you enjoyed.
I argued cases before Scalia when he was on the Supreme Court. And as a matter of fact, the last case that we argued that Scalia was on was an important case which my daughter, Aliza, who I'm very proud of, and she's my partner in the law firm that we have, Lewin and Lewin. And she was very active in years in which we litigated on behalf of a young baby who was born in Jerusalem, but who they refused to give a US passport that said that he was born in Israel. And Congress passed a law saying that anybody born in Jerusalem had the right to have their passport say Israel. The State Department didn't like that. And truthfully, the Justice Department also didn't like that. And the President, Bush, liked that. They refused to enforce it. So we brought a lawsuit from Menachem Benjamin Zivotofsky to have his passport say Israel. That litigation took from the time that he was born, we brought it shortly born, and the passport application was rejected, until after his bar mitzvah. We had hoped that for bar mitzvah, the Supreme Court would give him a US passport that said Israel. But the Supreme Court ruled that Congress did not have the constitutional right to pass that law because only the president could decide whether Jerusalem is in Israel. And we viewed that as a defeat. we lost that case. And among the dissenters who were on our side was my old classmate, Justice Scalia. He agreed with us, but only 2 other justices of the Supreme Court did. So we viewed that as a terrible defeat after all that litigation. But nobody anticipated, least of all the Supreme Court justices who ruled that way, that the next president of the United States would be a man called Donald J. Trump, and that Donald J. Trump would exercise the sole exclusive presidential right to recognize that Jerusalem is in Israel and is Israel's capital. So what appeared to be a loss when we argued the case in the Supreme Court, and I lateraled that argument off to my daughter because I thought I don't need another oral argument in the Supreme Court. By the way, I do not have more than 30. I count up, I think, 28 arguments that I did in the Supreme Court. But I didn't need another one, and I thought my daughter would do a much better job and is very articulate. So I asked her to do that argument, and she argued the case, and I thought she won it on the basis of on the merits of the case. But unfortunately, at the time, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against us. But it was one of these cases that it turns out was a victory, unknown at the time that it would be a victory, but it ended up being a great victory.
So now they do, despite State Department, they do allow you to put Jerusalem, Israel on your passport, a U.S. passport.
Israel. If you're born in Paris, your passport says France. It doesn't say Paris. If you're born in Rome, your passport says Italy. When you were born in Jerusalem, before Donald Trump and Ambassador Friedman, who was very active in having this affected, and Secretary of State Pompeo, your passport said Jerusalem. It didn't, no country, just Jerusalem, as if Jerusalem didn't belong to any country. But after Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and an embassy was opened in Jerusalem, a U.S. embassy opened in Jerusalem, finally, with pressure from Secretary of State Pompeo and the ambassador to Israel, Mr. Friedman, and frankly, with us, my daughter and I, pushing very aggressively, but we kept threatening that we were going to bring a lawsuit unless the State Department was going to change that. And ultimately, the State Department changed so that today, if you're born in Jerusalem as an American citizen, your passport is Israel, like it would say if you were born in Tel Aviv or Haifa.
Now, I just learned something very important, because my daughter was born in 1968 in Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. And she is an Israeli citizen, she has, and on her American passport, I always thought it said Israel, but I guess it says Jerusalem.
That's right.
We'll have to check.
Right.
After this is over, I'm going to call her up and ask.
So let's go back to you, Nat. Let's find out what happened after law school. You were on law review. What were your early career? What was your early career like?
They knew at the law review that I was unavailable sundown on Friday to nightfall on Saturday. But I made very good friends there, and I think they thought well of me. In those days, you're elected an officer of the review. The top officer is president. The next officer, which is really the managing editor, who makes sure that the magazine is out every month, is treasurer. I was elected treasurer, even though they knew I only had a 6-day work week. And I became treasurer of the law review. And it was the class of 1960. I don't know what they think of it today, but years ago, I thought the class of 1960 was the golden class of the Harvard Law School. Not only did it have Scalia, but it had Richard Arnold, who was the chief judge of the Eighth. It had Philip Hyman, who was a deputy attorney general. It had Ruckelshaus. It even had a presidential candidate who was not on the law review, by the way. Sarbanes, not Sarbanes was a senator, but what's his name? Now it slips my mind. The presidential candidate who lost from, I've forgotten his name right now. But anyway, in the class of
Could it be
Gary Hart?
What?
Not Gary Hart.
No, not Gary Hart. I don't know why I'm.
Well, we'll come up with it.
Dukakis, Michael Dukakis.
Oh, Michael Dukakis, yeah.
Michael
Well, he was
Dukakis.
governor of Massachusetts twice.
Right. He ran for president, and I voted for him, even
He
though
was in your class.
Michael Dukakis was in my class.
So what happened after law school?
Well, after law school, this is interesting. After law school, I clerked on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit for Chief Judge J. Edward Lombard, who was a terrific administrator of the court, and I worked for him. And unexpectedly, honestly, unexpectedly, I did not apply for it. I asked for it, but I got a call from a professor at the Harvard Law School, Paul Bator, whose class I had not taken. And he said to me on the phone, "How would you like to clerk on the Supreme Court?" I said, "Would I like to? Of course I'd like to clerk on the Supreme Court." He said, "Well, we're going to make a recommendation to Justice Harlan that you be his law clerk for next year." Total surprise to me.
I'm sorry, Justice who?
Harlan, John.
Oh,
M.
Justice Harlan, yeah.
His grandfather was on the court. His grandfather was the one who had dissented in Plessy versus Ferguson and said that separate is not equal. That was the first John Harlan. But this John Harlan was an Eisenhower appointee who was an amazing man. I mean, he was courtly, but friendly, open, and, you know, any view. And they said, "We're going to recommend you." Now, how did that happen? Because when I was at the Harvard Law School, I thought the natural thing would be to be working for a New York law firm. And I went up there to see the firms, and I was absolutely bowled over by how regal the firms were. They looked wealthy and terrific. I decided that's what I want to do. I want to be a lawyer in a New York law firm. So I applied. There were a good number of New York law firms that very specifically said, "We're not interested in interviewing anybody who's Jewish." That was open. This was 1960, before the Civil Rights Act. We don't want to speak to anybody who's Jewish, period. And that eliminated a number of law firms. Then there were other law firms that said, "Okay, we'll talk to the people who are Jewish." And even Jewish law firms, or partially Jewish, the best that were law firms that were sort of 50-50. Judge Simon Rifkin had a law firm called Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. It was known to be 50-50, you know, half Jewish. I applied there, like to other firms. And then they said to me, "I see you went to Yeshiva University. Are you a Sabbath observer?" I said, yes, I am. "That means you won't be available on a Friday afternoon if we have to file something by Friday afternoon?" "Well, I'll work in advance to get it done." No. You can't be a lawyer and not work on Friday afternoon or Jewish holidays, something has to be filed. So I couldn't get a job, literally, although I had been sixth in my class at law school at Harvard, I could not get a job for the summer after my second year. But a professor at Harvard named Benjamin Kaplan, who taught copyright and procedure, was looking for an assistant. So I worked for him that summer because I couldn't get a job. And Professor Ben Kaplan and I got along famously. And apparently he recommended to the others on the Harvard faculty that their recommendation to Justice Harlan for a law clerk should be Nathan Lewin. So that's why, totally out of the blue, I was told, go down to Washington and talk to Justice Harlan. And if you and he get along, you'll be the law clerk next year. There were only 2 law clerks in those days. Now there are 4 law clerks to each justice in the Supreme Court. There were only 2. But I was worried because the New York law firms did not take me because I was a Sabbath observer. So I went down and I met with Justice Harlan, who was cordial and friendly and marvelous. We had a nice discussion. I don't remember about what. And then towards the end, I said, hey, I better get into this. And I said, I have to tell you, Justice Harlan, I'm a Sabbath observer, which means that I can't work from Friday afternoon to Saturday night. Now, I knew that there had been one former law clerk on the Supreme Court who was a Sabbath observer, and that was a fellow by the name of Lou Henkin, who ultimately became a professor at Columbia, and his father was a very distinguished rabbi. I didn't know at the time, by the way, although I knew that he had clerked for Felix Frankfurter, I didn't know, and only discovered recently, that Henkin had actually slept in the Supreme Court in order to be available on Saturdays to talk to Justice Frankfurter. But I said to Harlan, I'm just not going to be available. I was planning to take an apartment near the court so that I could walk there, if I had to stay late on Friday. And Harlan looked at me and he said, oh, I have 2 law clerks. There was a co-clerk who came from the University of Virginia Law School, a man by the name of John Rhinelander, who was a prince of a fellow, and we worked together that year. But Harlan said to me, I have 2 law clerks. Your co-clerk can be in on Saturdays, and will you be available on Sundays? I said, of course, I'll be available on Sundays. He said, that's no problem then. That's good. You'll be available on Sundays. I'll have a 7-day-a-week office here. So that's Rhinelander was in on Saturdays, and I came in on Sundays. And in the winter, when Friday was short,
early.
The sun was going down, the court used to have conference Friday morning. They heard argument, by the way, in those days, in 150 cases a year. Argument was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, morning and afternoon. They don't do that today. And Friday morning, they would meet for conference. And then the justice would come out of the conference, which was attended only by the Supreme Court justices, to talk to us about what had happened at conference and what we could expect in the way of a workload. And in the winter, while I was sitting there, it got to be about 3:00 in the afternoon or 3:30, and with no prompting whatever, Justice Harlan would say to me, Nat, I think the sun's going down pretty soon. You better go home. He would send me home on Friday afternoon so as to be sure that I would not violate the Sabbath. I thought that was astounding, but that's what happened. I told that.
So what happened after your clerkship at the Supreme Court?
Clerkship, this was the Kennedy years. John Kennedy had been elected president. Robert Kennedy was the attorney general. And frankly, on the Harvard on the Supreme Court clerkship group, of the Supreme Court clerkship group, my friends and those who I thought highly of all wanted to work for the Kennedy Department of Justice. Bob Kennedy is Attorney General. So I applied to the Department of Justice because the Assistant Attorney General were hiring people to be special assistants. You'll be close up to the very top of the division in the Department of Justice. So I applied for those. And truthfully, I got rejected for 2 of those slots in favor of other people who were clerking on the Supreme Court who were picked instead of me. I was not, I guess, didn't look either dynamic enough or, somehow in the selection process was rejected by 2 of the Assistant Attorney General. But then I heard that the Assistant Attorney General in the criminal division was also looking for a special assistant. Now, criminal law was something I never thought I would be interested in. Never. There was one course given at Harvard in criminal law required in the first year for half a year. And you made kind of legalistic distinctions between larceny and larceny by trick. So I thought criminal law is crazy, but I want to be in the Department of Justice. So I applied to the Assistant Attorney General in the criminal division. His name was Herbert J. Miller, Jr., known as Jack Miller. I applied to him to be his special assistant. And lo and behold, he said, yeah, please come aboard. And before I knew it, at the end of that year, I got married to my wife, who I love, and I've been married to for 60 years, almost 60 years, 19. And, or it's more than 60 years, almost 60 years, okay. Coming on, yes, on our 60th anniversary. So I got married at the end of that year and ended up dragging her down to Washington. She was a New Yorker who only wanted to live in New York. But I said, look, I'm just going to take this job at the Department of Justice for a year or 2 years to work in the exciting Department of Justice. Come down and look at Washington. You may like it. So I started working at the Department of Justice in the criminal division. And 1 month after I started, Jack Miller, who was my boss, says to me, the Attorney General, that was Bob Kennedy, is very interested in a trial that's going to go on in Nashville, Tennessee very soon. And they need somebody with legal background who can write legal memoranda for the judge and uncover the legal issues down there in Nashville. So I want you to go down to Nashville. I went home and told my wife, who was shocked. I said, we're packing up and we're going to go to Nashville. She said, Nashville? Where's Nashville? We drove to Nashville, arriving, I must say, just before Yom Kippur in Nashville. And I informed my colleagues to be, when they greeted me with open arms, they were waiting with an endless list of legal memoranda and legal issues that had to be covered for this upcoming trial. And I told them, I'm going to go to work right away, but I want you to know that there's a Jewish holiday coming up called Yom Kippur, which is the day after tomorrow. And then there's another set of Jewish holidays called Sukkot, which is going to take up a couple of days next week. And I'm not going to be available on those days. Well, I was told afterwards that night they got on the phone to Attorney General Kennedy and said, what have you sent us? Some guy comes down here and says right at the very beginning, he's not going to be able to work. Well, it did not take much time because I worked around the clock the rest of the time, which were not Jewish holidays. And I found in Nashville, the local rabbi was extraordinarily helpful. in settling us, in arranging all kinds of things that were useful to us in Nashville, Tennessee. And I became, during the first Hoffa trial, what Hoffa called, he gave me a name which ultimately appeared in various books about the Hoffa trial. He said, there's this guy who keeps running out to the library and coming back with books that they argue to the judge about. He's instant law. That's what they called me, instant law, because I ran out.
This was the Hoffa trial, Jimmy Hoffa?
Jimmy Hoffa, yes.
He was being tried for what? For conspiracy or something?
Tried. This was the first Hoffa trial. He was being tried on a number of misdemeanors for his wife having received money in a union in a union contract of some kind. It was a purely misdemeanors, a whole bunch of misdemeanors. I didn't do any of that trial work. I did the legal research and would come in and help. The leading lawyer for the prosecution was a guy by the name of James Neal, who became famous years later as the prosecutor in the Watergate cases, who prosecuted Haldeman and Ehrlichman. But Neal was involved in the Watergate cases because I recommended him. I worked for him and with him in the first Jimmy Hoffa trial, and Hoffa, during that trial, tried to bribe jurors. And therefore, even though that first trial ended up with a hung jury, he was indicted again. And I was involved and had meetings with Bob Kennedy over the second Hoffa indictment, which was for obstruction of justice and jury bribery. And he was convicted in those cases and sent to jail. I argued for the government on the appeal of the Hoffa case in the Court of Appeals, and I argued for the government in the Supreme Court in the Hoffa case. That was one of the arguments I made when I was arguing cases in the Supreme Court for the US government, because after the Hoffa trial, or even before the Hoffa trial, I was on loan during the Hoffa trial, during the Chattanooga case, from the Solicitor General's office, because I was invited to join the Solicitor General's office by Archibald Cox. And he invited me to come there, and I started arguing cases in the Supreme Court as an assistant to the Solicitor General. There was a small office then. Now it has over 25 lawyers. In those days, I think it had 7 lawyers in addition to the Solicitor General, maybe 8 lawyers in addition to the Solicitor General. And you got an opportunity to argue cases in the Supreme Court, which was terrific.
So Nat, we are, I want to get through a bunch of other things here. Excuse me, because you've had such a storied career. We want to keep things going a little bit faster. How long did you spend in the government, and what did you do right after?
Well, I was in the government through the end of the Johnson administration. I went to the State Department. I was in the State Department during the Six-Day War in 1967. And
tell us about that experience. What
had a role in the State Department and helping the Jews who were leaving Egypt get to Israel and to France and other countries. But then I went back to the Justice Department to be a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. And I found myself also arguing very aggressive positions in favor of civil rights and difficult enforcement of the civil rights laws. And I was there during the last year of the Lyndon Johnson administration. Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General. I was there during the Martin Luther King assassination, and I was in charge of trying to find where the assassin of Martin Luther King was located. And we tracked him down to London and brought him back. And then when Nixon was elected, I was asked to stay by the new Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. He asked me to stay on. And originally I thought I might, but then I got a call again, like these calls come out of the blue. I got a call from Jack Miller, who had been my first boss. And he said to me, Nat, we're forming a law firm. He had formed a law firm with John Cassidy and Ray LaRocca, they had been with him at the Kirkland firm and had been at the Department of Justice. Cassidy had been there and I knew him. Will you join us as a partner in this little firm? And I came home and my wife said, well, it's time that you start earning a living rather than trying to on a government salary. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And so that's how the firm of Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin was formed. It became a top Washington, D.C. boutique law firm. And as a matter of fact, we have of our alumni from Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin, we have two really active members, current active members of the Supreme Court. Justice Kavanaugh worked in our firm, and Justice Barrett worked in our firm. And believe it or not, Justice Ketanji Jackson also worked in our firm. So Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin will have 3 Supreme Court justices, and Sri Srinivasan, who's the chief judge of the DC Circuit, worked in our firm. So for this little firm, which had at most 35 lawyers, it's quite a cachet. I mean, we were getting terrific young lawyers because we were giving them a lot of responsibility and had very interesting litigation.
Yes, I'm told that in a lot of law firms, you provide very high salaries to the elite law school graduates, and they really aren't worth it at the beginning because they're doing a lot of scut work of various kinds. That wasn't the case in your firm?
No, because what we did is we did almost nothing. No, we never had these huge cases with large records that the associates would go through. We would litigate at the very beginning. We were almost other than Edward Benner Williams, we were the only Washington law firm that really did criminal defense work. So the leading firms in Washington, when they had a criminal case, would send it over to Jack Miller, who had been Assistant Attorney General in the criminal division. So we got a lot of very good criminal cases, and we handed it out to the young associates. I had, from my Jewish associations, a lot of good cases, like, for example, the right to put up a Hanukkah menorah on a public place. And a lot of the young lawyers in our firm, including Barrett, had experience running those cases as very young lawyers. They were responsible for actually handling those cases in the district court. We were not reluctant to give our young lawyers a lot of responsibility. We thought very highly of them, which is why we had picked them in the first place.
And when did you set up your own law firm with your daughter?
Well, the economics of law practice is such that we got to be about 35 lawyers, and we had fantastically capable lawyers, and they saw that their contemporaries were making a lot more money in the big law firms. And they felt, look, we should be rewarded like our contemporaries. And we couldn't do that. We had, our practice was limited, and the incomes were limited. We had a respectable income, but not enough to match that. So it became necessary for us to look to other law firms to see whether a big law firm would absorb us. And the big law firm that made an offer that my partners couldn't refuse is Baker and Botts. Baker Botts out of Texas, uh, Baker's law firm, and they made the offer that my partners accepted to incorporate the entire law firm. There were a select group of us who did not want to do that. And among them was my daughter, who would come to us as a special counsel. After a couple of years, she was out of law school. So she was working with me. So she came, she and I decided we didn't want that. And we ended up forming our own father-daughter law firm, Lewin and Lewin.
When was
that year? When was that exactly?
That was 20 years ago. 2001, I think, is when we opened up. 2001.
And so I want to get on to a couple of other thoughts. One relates to your involvement in a lot of Jewish causes, your writing and so on. That came naturally, or how did you get into doing, op-eds and other activities in the Jewish world above and beyond law, or maybe in combination with law?
Well, I've always, since the time that I occupied this position in the Civil Rights Division, when I suddenly found that I was spending more time in meetings than actually in the courtroom and doing what I thought was constructive work, I've been reluctant to be involved in sort of organizational activities. I did agree to become president of the Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington, but I tried to avoid meetings, but I had opinions, and I would express those opinions in things I wrote and sent off to the New York Times. There was a time when the New York Times, printed my op-eds, and I sent a totally, unsolicited manuscript to the New Republic, which was just a block away from our law office. And the next day got back a note from the man who then owned the New Republic. And I liked the magazine because it was, although liberal, it was totally pro-Israel. This was before Marty Peretz owned it. And he said to me, "That's a great article. We're putting it on the front cover. Can you write some more?" And I said, "Okay." And I started writing about Supreme Court opinions regularly. And their regular Supreme Court expert was Alex Bickel of Yale Law School. Bickel, unfortunately, was ill and died very young. And he was reducing his writings, and I was writing about the Supreme Court opinions. And Bickel wrote to the publisher of the New Republic, Gil Harrison, and said, "Look, this guy Lewin, I never met Bickel, but this guy Lewin is pretty good. Why don't you use him some more?" And the next thing I knew, Harrison invited me to be a contributing editor to the New Republic. And I wrote regularly for the New Republic about Supreme Court opinions. I would just, write it out, write this. In those days, you wrote it out in longhand. I would take a yellow pad and I'd write out whatever I thought about a Supreme Court opinion. And the next thing I knew, it was published. And then Marty Peretz bought the magazine. We got along well. I didn't get along with all his editors-in-chief, though. And ultimately, when they started revising what I had written and not even running it past me, I said to Peretz, "I can't take this any longer." And I quit. I stopped being a contributing editor of the New Republic, but I continued sending articles to the Times, to other magazines, and succeeded in getting those printed, and to the Jewish magazines too, the Jewish Press and others.
Yeah, well, so what would you say would be some of your most memorable cases over the years?
Well, there's the case that I'm well known for and frankly lauded excessively by the Lubavitch or Chabad Hasidim, which is the case I litigated to establish the ownership of the library of the previous Rebbe that had been sitting in the at the headquarters in Crown Heights, and his family, the family of the previous Rebbe, one of his daughters and a grandson claimed that they had personal ownership of it. And I represented the then current Rebbe, who's passed away a long time ago, in claiming that that belonged to Chabad. And we litigated that in federal court and won that case and won the appeal. So I'm a hero for Chabad. And that case, to me, was interesting because it called on my knowledge of Jewish, Hebrew background, all that, and at the same time on legal skills, which I was able to use in the courtroom. It was an actual trial.
Interesting.
But I also, I represented Ed Meese. I represented Richard Nixon in the Supreme Court. Although my New Republic piece, the last New Republic piece I wrote, I called for the criminal prosecution of Richard Nixon. Then Jack Miller came in from California and said, we will now be representing former President Nixon. And we represented him. And Miller and I argued in the Supreme Court that the taking of his papers, which was done under a special congressional law, was unconstitutional. That was a bill of attainder and otherwise unconstitutional. We lost that case. Nobody could then win a case for Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
What's your
Go ahead.
today of Donald Trump?
Well, I think Donald Trump had a lot of policies, including the policy regarding Israel, that I admire and I think will correct. I think he has maybe various shortcomings that people have criticized him for. That's, he did manage to get 71 million Americans who voted to have him be president again. Now, that's not as many Americans who voted for Joe Biden, but nonetheless, it's not something that can just simply be ignored.
But what about his attempts to keep, to deny that he lost?
I cannot psychoanalyze or know what went through Trump's mind. I've represented people who, even after they're found guilty and after the evidence is overwhelming, claim that they're innocent. I don't know whether he honestly believes that he won. I can't say that he doesn't honestly believe that. I don't know. As I say, he was president. He got 71 million people who voted for him. And he may honestly believe that the election was stolen. I don't necessarily agree with that. But if that's his belief, I don't think he should be criminally prosecuted for having believed that or continuing to believe that.
Well, yeah, I think we should move toward concluding here. How do you see the situation of American Jews? It's a big question to end with, but American Jews, you talked about the anti-Semitism that you experienced in 1960. Of course, we're in a different world today, but there seem to be a number of threats. You optimistic or not so?
I consider myself fortunate that I lived through a golden age of Jews in America. I mean, the fact that I was able, all the things I've talked about, the fact that I was able to go to Harvard, that I was able to clerk on the Supreme Court, that I was able to argue cases in the Supreme Court, that I was able to represent the Attorney General, to represent Jodie Foster and John Lennon, and be a lawyer here. I thought that's astounding that I could live through that age. But I'm very, very disillusioned by what is going on now. I mean, you know, the unfortunate thing is that Jewish history is full of periods when Jews were treated well and then attacked and treated very, very badly. And I'm afraid that that's what's happening now. I think, you know, Israel is essential to Jewish existence. The strength of Israel is essential to Jewish existence. I'm not reluctant or embarrassed about the fact that the Jewish state is strong and may take very strong steps to continue its existence as a place where Jews can feel safe. That may end up, unfortunately, being the only place in the world where Jews will be able to be safe. I used to think that that could not happen. There could not be a problem in the United States. I was wrong. It was fortunate, and it's now questionable.
College campuses.
I mean, and the problem is the people who are propagating the dangers to American Jews. What's going on the college campuses today, you know, and the increasing drive by professors and members of faculties at universities to attack Israel and to blame the Jews. I can't believe it. It's not, and it comes, unfortunately, as the prophet Isaiah said, it really, to me, is tragic that it's Jews who frequently lead the attack against Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're concerned as well, but we're you know, I am still an optimist. I'm from the Middle West of the country, and I think have experienced a lot less than in terms of anti-Israel activity anyway than in some of the East and West Coast places. But in any event, we really appreciate your participation in this series. Tzvi, would you have any closing thoughts?
No, it's just we generally like to end by saying sei gesund.
Sei gesund. We end all our interviews with that. Not just yours, Nat. Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. Sei gesund. Bleib gesund. Stay well.